Welcome to the biohackingmyillness.com podcast, biohacking your way to optimal health. The content of this show is for informational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any illness or medical condition. Nothing in today's discussion is meant to serve as medical advice or as information to facilitate self-treatment. As always, please discuss any potential health-related decisions with your own personal doctor. And now, your host and biohacking coach, Dr. Arthur Mariano.
Hi there, guys, and welcome to another episode of my podcast. As you can see, I'm breaking a sweat here, and I'm really trying to make an effort and release one episode a week, which means going through intense work, not only finding the right people, but also, tuning the questions and preparing the whole podcast. I enjoy it pretty much. Otherwise, this wouldn't be physically possible, but I just enjoy this very much. And I also enjoy when I find, I'm really interested about therapies and hacks that really kind of surpass the problems that someone who's chronically ill may have, or someone who wants to take their health to a whole new level. And I think that I found something back in the day, in that context regarding thiamine, and which is vitamin B1. And I did, experiment with it. I had some good results, but I thought, there has to be more about this. And I started to doing some further research on B1, not only B1 deficiency, but this idea that we can megadose B1 and sort of bypass some of the toxicity problems that we may have in our body. And so I love this topic, and I think that I brought the expert, the ultimate expert in this field. He's a very young guy, but very talented individual, very bright researcher as well. And his name is Elliot Overton. So I decided to bring him over. He has a YouTube channel. He talks about thiamine deficiency all the time. But I wanted to bring him in to talk about B1, megadosing. And, we got into several different topics. We got into the microbiome at some point. We both got very passionate about it. And I think it was just a beautiful podcast. I'm really getting a kick out of this. And especially when I engage into deep conversations with my guest, and we come to a final outcome that is actionable stuff that we can just do, of course, under the supervision of your medical authority. But this information, I'm trying to seek the truth, like I say, get to the bottom of things. And this podcast was just beautiful in terms of shedding some light on megadosing B1 and how to use it really, and what's its potential. So I hope you guys like this podcast with Elliot. I did enjoy it very much, and I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. Okay, let's get into it. Today I brought Elliot Overton to the podcast because I'm also very interested in various of the different B vitamins, and B1 in particular, thiamine. And Elliot is probably the most expert on this field that I know of, and probably even among the people I don't know of. Elliot is probably the most expert on this topic, and so I brought him over to talk about this. Elliot, thank you so very much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. So in 60 seconds or less, who is Elliot Overton, and what got you into B1, into thiamine?
Okay. I am a nutritional therapist. I have practiced for several years now. And the thing that got me interested in B1 was coming across Dr. Derek Lonsdale's research on it several years ago now, and kind of cross-referencing that with the fact that I hadn't learned much about B1 in my nutritional training. I'm pretty sure that most other nutrition colleges or universities, even very high-level elite universities, don't teach that much about the clinical efficacy or therapeutic value of using thiamine to treat all to support different diseases. So anyway, I came across Lonsdale's work and started reading some of his case studies. I picked up his book, who he co-authored with Chandler Mars. And reading that was really like a breath of fresh air, introducing this overall concept of thiamine as a metabolic stimulant to some extent, thiamine having the capacity to really quite miraculously improve such a wide variety of different health conditions, and being a nutrient which is so often deficient or so often kind of processed in the wrong way in our modern world because of modern dietary practices, because of medications, because of so many influences which we're exposed to in our modern world, how they almost selectively hamper our ability to use thiamine and therefore generate cellular energy. So ever since I kind of came across that concept, I've really dedicated myself to learning as much as possible about this, trawling through as much of the research and digesting as much as possible, and I'm working with hundreds of individuals now using the kind of principles laid out by Lonsdale and Chandler Mars.
Yeah, I'm sure that you were also attracted to the fact that this is actually a readily available and very cheap nutrient that we can just get. And at the same time, it's very miraculous as well. So just to be clear, you were not B1 deficient. You didn't have anyone in your family who was B1 deficient. You didn't treat anyone in your family.
No one in my family, I wouldn't say. I've used B1 on and off for a couple of different things. Some things it worked for, some things it didn't. I think at the time, going back, maybe I can't recall exactly when I first read the book and came across Lonsdale's work, but it was several years ago. And at the time I was having some runoff digestive issues. I think that was kind of related to a diet which was very rich in oxalates, which I kind of put two and two together and went off on that tangent as well. But overall, no, I've not really used it on anyone in my immediate family. I think I did see benefits, but they were temporary. But I've never really fit the clinical phenotype of someone who needs high amounts of B1, right?
Got it.
That's in contrast to so many other people who seem to really benefit from it.
Right. You also talked about oxalates. What got you into oxalates? Was the fact that you run into some issues of oxalates yourself?
Well, it was the fact that I was eating a lot of oxalates whilst I was studying nutrition. And after that, because we're kind of taught in nutrition school that, plants are extremely healthy, all forms of plants. And in fact, any amount of plants is better than no plants. And the more that you eat, the healthier you're going to be, kind of thing. So at the time I was eating copious amounts of oxalate, and I was dealing with some issues, but I never really put two and two together. I didn't link it with the fact that I was eating a high oxalate diet. I actually became interested in oxalates, and that's another story, not because of my own issues, but really because of some of the issues that I was seeing in clients, which I didn't understand at the time, So
Right.
that was a very interesting kind of avenue of exploration in and of itself.
Right. So this talk is primarily going to be about B1, but I may throw one or two questions about oxalates down the road.
Cool.
Because I think that this is actually very, very interesting. I myself eat a lot of oxalates. I mean, to be honest, I just eat one food that is very high in oxalates, but I eat a lot of it, which is beets. Beets are like, my liver loves beets. And so I just eat a lot of that. I have beets in every meal that I have. I'm a beet fan for sure. So let's get back to B1. What are the main symptoms or the common symptoms that people usually experience when they are B1 deficient?
Okay, yeah. So B1 deficiency, it's probably a lot more common than is ordinarily thought to be, particularly in the Western world. There's this myth that people who eat a standard diet which is fortified with vitamins and minerals, are generally not going to be deficient. The reason why it's so difficult to identify is not only because testing is quite difficult to identify, but really because of the wide spectrum of symptoms that it can cause, right? There's no real one symptom which can be present in this kind of issue. And this is really kind of what makes many clinicians and doctors scratch their heads when someone comes to them with certain symptoms, and they're not really sure why they've got them. They've got no identifiable actual medical disease or medical condition. And so the way that I think of a B1 deficiency, primarily in the vast majority of people, there will be some symptoms in like a triad of systems. So 3 different systems which are primarily going to be affected by B1 is going to be the brain, first of all, and the central peripheral nervous system. So this is essentially anything which pertains to brain function. This can be as mild as brain fog or anxiety, or it can be as severe as Parkinsonism or a condition which might mimic multiple sclerosis. It can be tremors. It can be neurological conditions which may manifest as neuropathy, may manifest as difficulty with motor coordination. In its most severe form, it can be loss of speech, visual disturbance, and paralysis as well. Okay, so anything relating to the brain, anything relating to the peripheral nervous system, and what I mean by that is peripheral neuropathy, fibromyalgia type pain. So that can be burning, that can be numbness, that can be paresthesia. It can also affect our coordination. So someone might feel as though they have very heavy legs. They may have difficulty they may think that they want to do something with their hands or their legs, but actually it feels as though the information isn't quite being sent from the brain to the periphery, right? And so we can have lots of issues, and anything really which presents as a peripheral neurological condition can be related or caused by a thiamine deficiency. The second organ is going to be the heart and the circulatory system. And there's a lot of evidence which would suggest that even conditions which are not usually considered to be thiamine related are actually responsive to high doses of thiamine supplementation. So this can be heart failure. This can be any kind of arrhythmia, when the heartbeat is when it flutters, when there's murmurs, when there's anything like that, when there's problems with circulation. So it can relate to if someone has edema or fluid retention or difficulty regulating their blood pressure. And then what we also going to oftentimes see in people with deficiencies in B1 is digestive issues. And I think that this is probably the least acknowledged even in the medical community. And I just want to make a point here that the primary signs and symptoms originally, the way that we learned about them, or the way that the medical establishment learned about them was in Japan. If we go back in history, we look at when the Japanese started polishing their rice, they started taking away the outer husk, the bran which contains thiamine. They'd end up with pure white rice. And unfortunately, the people who would eat this in large quantities, especially when there was poverty, they would develop these strange symptoms. And again, there would be this triad. It would be the brain, central nervous system, the heart, but also the gut. And they referred to this condition as beriberi. Now, you can have beriberi in the brain or peripheral nervous system. You can have beriberi in the heart, which is called wet beriberi, or you can have GI beriberi. Again, there's not actually that much research on this in the Western literature. And if there is, it's kind of skirts on the edge. But what I've honestly found is that sometimes what present as gut conditions, whether it's small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, hypochlorhydria, so low stomach acid, gastroparesis, basically any condition which involves poor motility or poor communication, poor production of the digestive organs. So give you an example. The stomach is ordinarily meant to make hydrochloric acid. That is what is designed to break down or to start the process of breaking down protein. Now, to make stomach acid, you need the right signals coming to your stomach to tell certain cells in your stomach to release this. That comes from the autonomic nervous system. Now, if you don't have enough B1, the autonomic nervous system linking in with the enteric nervous system, you don't get the right communication. And what that means is the organs start producing less of what they're meant to produce. That means less stomach acid. That means less digestive enzymes. That means less.
That's also part of the gut brain connection, right?
Indeed. Yeah, indeed. But in this way, it's the brain to gut connection. Right. So in this case, someone might have constipation. Yeah, indeed. So they might have constipation, they might have SIBO, they might have chronic diarrhea, they might have intestinal permeability, they might have all of these kind of common gut conditions.
But there's one particular thing that seems to be affected, especially when you said that people may present B1 deficiency as SIBO, for instance, which is the MMC, the migrating motor complex. Is that right? Does it affect this system primarily?
So that's one element of it, right? There's the motility aspect to this. Right. So there is the motility part of it, but there's also so someone who develops SIBO, for your audience, you probably know what it is, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. There's a couple of key risk factors for that. First of all, low stomach acid is going to be one of those, because if you don't produce stomach acid, acid is what's killing bacteria. Absolutely. That can mean that bacteria can get into the upper small intestine and start to proliferate. Okay, so that's one thing. If in the thiamine deficient gut, oftentimes there can be low stomach acid. Second thing, like you hinted at, is the motility. So you've got the migrating motor complex, but you've also got multiple mechanisms by which the upper small intestine or the gut as a whole has to propel food. This is called peristalsis. Now, oftentimes in people who have issues with B1 or this enteric nervous system problem, they can't propel food at the rate in which they need to. So even if they do have stomach acid, they can't. You end up with
just stagnant food that is going to ferment, right? That creates SIBO.
Exactly,
right?
Precisely.
But, and the thing would be, so do you think that B1 deficient people can have, for instance, low HCl, and therefore that's one of the causes of SIBO and other problems like improper digestion and whatnot, but not have the MMC affected? Is that possible?
Yeah, indeed. It seems to be absolutely different for everyone, and this is the thing.
So
like,
one person
what are the
can
symptoms?
end up with a MMC that is highly sluggish, let's say, and the rest is working fine, and some other people may have low HCl and everything else is fine. This is still possible, right?
That's exactly the thing, right? There's no one, like I said before, there's no one way in which people will present if they have B1 deficiency. They can have some symptoms. They might not have other symptoms. In fact, the motility might be too fast. They might have chronic diarrhea. Okay. And it's like, well, I've had people who have had severe diarrhea, and only when they take B1 in high doses do they actually start getting full bowel movements. Now, how on earth can we explain that? B1's not working as a laxative, right? It's having another effect. And one other element to this is just gut inflammation as a whole, because, you know, you've got the vagus nerve, you've got the gastric mucosa, which are essentially meant to be lubricated. You've got abundance of immune cells in the gut. And ultimately, you've got the vagus nerve, which is responsible for essentially turning down inflammation. So you've got lots of inflammatory triggers going on in the gut. But if your vagus nerve is functioning properly, it can modulate the inflammatory response. So you don't have chronic gut inflammation to things that you shouldn't necessarily be reacting to. In people who have B1 deficiency, what can end up happening is they lose vagal tone. The vagus nerve does not work as it's meant to work, and therefore they end up with this chronic inflammatory kind of event, which is occurring in the gut, and they have very little kind of protection against that. So that is like the initiating factor.
What I was getting into, because I thought, you know, some people may have problems in HCl, MMC, whatever, gut lubrication, inflammation, and it all seems to be a deficient vagal tone at the end of the day. And perhaps B1 impacts vagal tone, and so that's where its role is primarily noticed, and people may end up developing any of these problems and not necessarily all of them, right? Yeah. So is this actually known that B1 is directly influencing vagal tone, like the efficiency of the vagus nerve?
Yeah, so it's highly likely. There's some Chinese and Japanese literature, which that's the only conclusion that they can come to. I mean, in the Chinese literature, you've got cases of treating infantile diarrhea, infantile gastrointestinal paralysis, and using very high amounts of B1 on a consistent basis in hundreds of infants, right? Hundreds of
Right,
infants.
right.
Now, their conclusion was that the only way in which this is likely going to be working is by when someone is low in B1, you get issues with an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase, right? And that breaks down acetylcholine, meaning that acetylcholine is not working as it should do, essentially. And so what you end up seeing is that in a lot of the research, using B1 tends to affect systems which are innervated by the vagus nerve, and there's good theoretical justification for why that works. I'm almost
seems very logical.
Absolutely certain that it's improving vagal tone because the vagus nerve is using a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. That's the primary neurotransmitter. Now, to make acetylcholine, you need enough thiamine. To prevent acetylcholine from being broken down, you need enough thiamine. And here's another thing is that there's some very interesting research which would suggest that acetylcholine can't be released from the neuron and act on the other neuron without B1. Okay, so this is like a non-coenzyme effect. You've got B1, its effect on enzymes, but you've also got non-coenzyme effects. So it seems to be working primarily through addressing vagal nerve problems, but probably also on site as well in the various organs.
Got it. So in this podcast, I talked to two different types of audiences. One who's suffering from chronic illness, and another audience who wants to biohack their body to their health in general. So they may be entirely healthy, but they want to go to the next level. Would you say, though, this was not a question that I had in the script here, but would you say that someone who wants to improve their vagal tone, even if it is not deficient, even if it is like a quote unquote normal vagal tone, they just want to improve it, would B1 in theory help with that? So someone who is stuck in fight or flight, for instance, someone who is unable to deal with high amounts of stress, would in theory B1 be useful for this matter? Or if you prefer, have you seen anybody using B1 to this end and actually have good results?
Yeah, so here's the thing, right? B1 is not only the kind of thing that you would take to address a deficiency. And this is the important point, and this is especially important in chronic illness, but also for people who don't have chronic illness and you just want to feel a bit better. Ultimately, some of the main effects of B1, I don't think are involved in addressing a deficiency. In fact, I think many of the people who benefit are not deficient to start off with. That's a bit of a controversial term, but really the people who use it in high doses, I think it's preposterous to assume that they're deficient if they're on a very good diet. They've been on a very good diet for a long time, and actually they've been taking the RDA, which is 1 milligram or whatever, and the multivitamin for several years, yet they still get marvelous results. So what we're dealing with here is we're using B1 essentially as a drug or as an ergogenic support, right? And in that case, you look at the effect that B1 can have even on a non-deficient brain. Well, it can stimulate the production of dopamine, for instance. It stimulates the production of serotonin, noradrenaline at certain points in the day. There's lots of evidence looking at its effect on the brain, which would suggest that it can be used as like a mood enhancer or an attention kind of improver, for instance, if someone is stuck in chronic fight or flight response. I've had many people who don't have any established health condition who say that, they might have just had a bit of difficulty getting to sleep at nighttime, or they feel as though they have poor tolerance for stress. Well, B1 in conjunction with probably a couple of other nutrients can be used and kind of like a medicine, using it in a medicinal fashion to counteract some kind of an imbalance elsewhere. So we're not just looking at addressing a deficiency, that's for sure.
Right. Yeah, this is a very important point because probably the audience was listening to this and saying, yeah, this is B1 who's lacking and nothing else is lacking. And it may not be the case. But at the same time, they may be listening to this and saying, well, I've got some of these problems. I've got like digestive problems. I may have, poor vagal tone. I may have like my cognitive function is not as good as I want it to be. And how do these people determine whether they are B deficient? B1 deficient, I'm sorry.
Deficient in B1, yeah. So the standard way that a medical doctor would go about doing that is probably looking at a plasma vitamin B1 level. Unfortunately, the evidence is fairly certain on this being an ineffective tool to assess B1. It basically measures short-term status. There's lots of things that can affect plasma B1 levels. It doesn't tell us how much is in the cell. I mean, I know you spoke to Gregory Russell Jones, who probably says something very similar about B12, right? You can have a problem with processing thiamine inside the cells. You might not have enough inside the cells. You might have enough, but actually you can't use it very well for various reasons.
Right.
So
well,
in terms of testing,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but this is actually true for pretty much everything. So I got a lot of training in blood work. And what I can say about blood work is that you have to look at several angles at the same time. So extracellular space, intracellular space, and also sometimes the capability of utilizing whatever is inside the cell or transporting even something that is outside the cell inside the cell. So there's all this different angles of how to assess a deficiency or poor underutilization of something. So what is the answer for B1? Do we have to look at several factors at the same time?
Yeah, I'd like to say that was the case. Yeah, I mean, you could take the kind of more functional testing route and you could say, right, okay, what tests have the most evidence behind them? Well, that's going to be an erythrocyte transketolase test, which is available in the US. It's available by a lab called HDRI. It's also available in the UK and in Europe via Biolab UK. You could look at that test. You could also look at some other functional markers, such as maybe pyruvate, maybe lactate, some of the branched chain amino acid metabolites on an organic acids test. Those can be elevated in a deficiency. Those can be elevated for other reasons as well. That's the problem. There's no single marker other than the erythrocyte transketolase test, which is going to tell you about B1 status. But I will be honest, like a lot of the time people come back with normal erythrocyte transketolase and yet they still respond to B1.
Right.
Now, here's the thing, right? If you want to assess how, like,
I guess that the only certainty that we would have with that marker is if it is low, then for sure people will benefit from B1, right? That's the only.
That's it.
Yeah.
If it's low, then it tells you there's a deficiency. If it's normal, it doesn't tell you that there's not a need for B1. Absolutely. Here's the thing, right? And this is what some researchers actually acknowledge, is that you can be deficient, or let's say you can be low in thiamine in a single organ. You can have enough in the body, but you can have a deficiency in a single organ, which is causing us the health problem. Right. This has been known for the heart. You can have a functional B1 deficiency in the heart and not have a systemic deficiency. Same in the brain. Same, Parkinson's disease. Excellent example of completely dysregulated thiamine metabolism only in certain regions of the brain. Purely normal labs in every other respect. Right. So really, like, unless you're going to get a biopsy in your brain or something, I mean, it's preposterous to assume that, testing is really accurate at all.
Yeah.
It can give us kind of some information.
Yeah, exactly. That was actually the point that I was trying to get to. So this is quite complex. And by the way, regarding this idea that we are sometimes very deficient in one part of the body and sometimes toxic in other parts of the body, this happens with copper. Sometimes we are toxic in some parts of the body and we lack copper in other organs or other parts of the body. Or sometimes we actually have enough copper, but it's not the right form, right? So I think that over the past years, at least that was a realization of mine when I started to study minerals and vitamins, I understood this, that we may have not enough in one part and more than enough in another part, and they are both creating problems. And then there's the problem of the actual form that we need in that particular part of the body. And we also have the issue that sometimes one part of the body works better with a special form of that mineral or vitamin, and the other part of the body works better with a different form. But I think that this is the point that I was trying to get to. So this is quite complex, probably expensive, and probably very time consuming to test. So would it be safe to just test B1 supplementation and see what happens, and slowly titrate up until a point where we say that, unless we have symptoms before that, of course, but assuming that we don't have the symptoms until we hit a so-called megadose, would this be safe in order to essentially determine whether we can benefit from B1 supplementation or not?
Yeah, that's generally the only way that you can probably do it. That's the only way.
Right.
And that's, been a kind of hard realization for myself to come to over the past couple of years, that there is no hard and fast way to test for this. Even if you're very analytically or methodically minded and you like to have test results, it just is not sufficient. The best way is to try B1. And ultimately, since B1, unlike many of the other B vitamins, or some of the other B vitamins, which do have quite valid kind of concerns when they're taken in excess, similar to minerals, thiamine is fortunately one of the things that the body is really quite good at processing excess amounts of. Now, that's not to say that someone can't get unwanted symptoms if they take a very large dose, but generally it's considered non-toxic. What that means is that if you take too much, the body will basically get rid of it. So really, there's no actual downside to at least attempting a mild dose of thiamine and gradually working up. In fact, that is, I think Lonsdale and Chandler Mars are in perfect agreement here, in that is the only way to tell whether you're going to be able to actually benefit from B1. And in my experience, there's no one that I won't try it on, unless there's, there maybe like a really rare exception. But there's no one that I don't try B1 on, because there's such a wide variety of people who I've seen benefit from it. It makes no sense not to at least try it,
right?
Especially since it's so cheap as well.
Megadosing it every single time you try it?
No, not to start off with.
Right.
It really depends.
But is that the target long term, to reach like a megadose if we want to see whether we really have benefit from it?
That depends on context, right? So if someone presents as though they've got a classical deficiency, they might not need to megadose. They might be perfectly fine with taking 100 or 200 milligrams over a couple of months, and the issue gets dealt with, right, and actually they don't need to supplement it anymore. When we're talking about megadosing, now there are some people who are severely deficient who need megadosing. But really, with megadosing, what we're looking at is a spectrum of conditions which are not necessarily characterized by a classical thiamine deficiency, like I said before. So really, the aim is going to be different. If someone's deficient, they probably need a lot. Well, everyone will need a lot higher than the RDA if they're going to be taking it. But for someone who's deficient, you might get away with 100 milligrams. For someone who is a candidate for megadosing it, they could need grams.
Right. Got it. So I will come back to the concerns that I have on the on megadosing B1 and accounting for other minerals and vitamins, because I do have one or two questions regarding that. But for now, so let's just assume that someone is B1 deficient. What is the best time of the day, if you're aware of that, if there is one, to supplement with thiamine? So usually I follow Ravitch's work in this regard. So I take anabolic vitamins or minerals at night, and I take catabolic ones in the morning. And we all know that tannin-containing foods like coffee and tea are not good to take close to B1. But with this in mind and this taken care of, would you say that there's any particular time of the day that we should be taking the B1, provided that we are deficient?
So again, that's context dependent. And the reason I say that is because some people, it would depend on the kind of effects that they get. So if someone takes B1 and it gives them lots of energy, it makes them feel as though they don't have fatigue, but it also is quite stimulating for them, then that's going to be potentially a big problem if they take it at nighttime, because really one of the key kind of side effects of taking too much thiamine, or taking thiamine at all at different times of day, is insomnia. Right. For some people, it gives them so much energy that they can't go to sleep. So for those people, I would say, well, you need to take thiamine in the morning time. And that's what most people find, in my opinion. That said, for someone who already has insomnia and someone who might have a variety of other kind of symptoms, for them, actually taking thiamine later in the day can have the opposite effect to actually allow someone to start sleeping properly. And again, it comes back to this kind of like remarkable effect that it can address one person's symptoms in one way, but do the exact opposite in another way, both to provide benefit depending on context, Anyway, yeah, in terms of if someone is using high doses, generally what I find is that if they take all of their B1 in the morning, for instance, then they might get to a point midday or later, earlier on in the afternoon, mid to late afternoon even, where they hit a crash and some of their symptoms start coming back. And in fact, sometimes the symptoms get worse. So for instance, someone might have severe anxiety, or they might have like a major energy crash, or they might get insomnia for some reason. And in that kind of situation, what Chandler Mars was actually the one who kind of put me onto this, and I tried it in several people and it seems to work very well, is what ends up happening is that they give themselves a big bolus of thiamine, and that kind of temporarily restores some function to their system. But then because of thiamine's kind of relatively short half-life and its ability to be excreted from the body relatively quickly, then what ends up happening is that they get to a point where their blood thiamine levels drop.
Right.
They need a booster. So for these people, sometimes it works to have thiamine every 2 hours. Take it every 2 hours and take it before bed to get a good night's sleep. Really, like there's no strict answer for that. It's completely context dependent.
Wow, this seems to be quite complex in the sense that we have to experiment to know whether we benefit from it. And even the time of the day and probably the dose at each time also requires some experimentation. Great.
Yeah.
So I've touched on the fact that tannin-containing foods are essentially lead to B1 deficiency. How about coffee enemas? So I do a lot of coffee enemas. Can these induce a B1 deficiency in someone? Have you heard of this before? Have you met anybody who did a lot of coffee enemas and ended up being B1 deficient?
I think it's highly unlikely. Unless the coffee enema is making its way up to the ileum and the duodenum kind of thing. Right. So the thiamine, right, coffee's interaction with thiamine is purely the tannin, right? It's the tannin coming into direct contact with the thiamine molecule, and that basically deactivates the thiamine molecule so that you can't absorb it. Okay. That's the case with other things as well. So if you do an enema, I mean, what is your aim? Like, how far up into the colon do you suspect that the enema goes? Is it primarily in the large intestine?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So if it's in the large,
I wouldn't say that it reaches the end of the colon. I think that actually people say that coffee enemas are actually very safe in terms of preserving the microbiome, because the coffee doesn't reach the third part of the colon where the microbiome is. So I think that even though in my case, I do find that coffee enemas induce the MMC to work faster, or they induce. So at the end of the day, if I do a coffee enema, I may be able to see particles of food in my stool that I didn't see if I didn't do the enema. So, so I think that, even though it doesn't reach the small intestine, I think that it just increases essentially the evacuation and the motility, right? But the reason why I asked this, and I knew that the coffee wouldn't be in contact with the small intestine, therefore causing deficiency. But my rationale for this question was the following. So when we do a lot of coffee enemas, we have to supplement with potassium. I'm not saying one coffee enema a week. I think that's perfectly reasonable, but sometimes I do 4 in a day. And when you get to this level, you have to use potassium. Otherwise, you become potassium deficient very quickly, because the system just expels a lot of water and it needs the minerals. Is this the case with B1? I wouldn't say so, but this is the rationale for the question.
I'm not sure how much thiamine would be contained within the fluid. You know what I mean? Like,
yes,
a lot of thiamine excretion is occurring via the urine. So I don't know. I mean, maybe it would contain, just like plasma plasma thiamine. You've always got thiamine in your blood. That's the case. And a lot of the stored thiamine is in the blood.
Right.
But how is that like a composition? Like, is that included in the composition of fluid that you get rid of, like such as your electrolytes?
Hard to say, right?
I don't know. I don't think so. And I don't think it would be significant because, thiamine is quite high in red blood cells. It's high in the organs. I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. I don't think it would be able to.
Right, got it. But I think that someone very qualified to answer this question would be someone who actually needs that booster that we were talking about throughout the day, because their excretion is so fast. It would be interesting for such a person to do a coffee enema and just assess whether they need the booster earlier because they did the coffee enema. I think it would provide us with an answer to this question. Okay, but let's move on. So let's just assume that in general, coffee enemas do not induce B1 deficiency. It's not too much of a problem, at least. Okay, question now about B1, or questions about B1 in many chronic health conditions, which is actually what got me mostly interested in talking to you about B1, because like you said, B1 can play a role in many chronic health conditions. So I've seen from your work and the guide that you have, and we will talk more about it later on, that you think that people with a variety of chronic health conditions may benefit from megadosing B1. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, okay. So this is kind of straying into more theoretical, conceptual territory. There is evidence to support this concept, and there's thousands of anecdotes. Basically, right. So the traditional concept of supplementing with a vitamin or a mineral is either to support your levels, just as a general kind of like getting the average amount that you need, or alternatively to address a deficiency. Now, what you find is in a lot of the literature, B1 has also been used for other conditions being dementia, being Parkinson's, being multiple sclerosis, being chronic fatigue, multiple different kind of conditions which have favorable responses. Now, there's not much evidence, not much research, not as much as there could be. In terms of clinical experience, what I've found is that very high doses can be enormously effective for a wide variety of different things. Now, the question is, why does this happen? Well, if you look at some of the research, there was a couple of case studies published by a neurologist called Antonio Costantini, based in Italy. What he found was very interesting, and it basically kind of confirms the idea of Lonsdale, who's spoken about this concept for many years, is that what he found was that using moderate to quite large doses of B1, 500 milligrams, 1,000 milligrams, 1,500 milligrams, produced basically no change in fibromyalgia symptoms, right? It was only when they reached a critical threshold. There was an all or nothing effect, in other words. Basically, when they reached a certain level, 1,800 milligrams to be exact, they noticed a dramatic shift in symptoms almost overnight. So this group of people, they've been taking B1 in high doses. 1,500 milligrams is 1,500 times the amount that you would get from food. It's a massive amount, okay? It really is. You'd never find this in nature, anything approximating this dose. They had no effect. But then for some reason, at 300 milligrams more, which is a fifth, they found almost some of them like 70% improvement, 80% improvement in some of these symptoms. Now, the question is, why does that occur? Now, what he theorized was that
why the tipping point, right?
Why the tipping point? Yeah, if it was just addressing a deficiency, you would see that at 500 milligrams, you'd see that at 1,000, you'd see that at 1,500.
Even if the improvement was lower, we would still see something, right?
Exactly. It doesn't make sense. It does not make sense that these people were deficient. They tested their blood levels. They had no other signs of deficiency. They just have fibromyalgia. So the question is, what on earth is going on here? How can we explain this mechanism? And he articulated this in his paper. He says, look, what we are doing is we are not trying to address a deficiency. In fact, what we're trying to do is stimulate enzymatic activity in areas of the body which has been like inhibited by other causes. Basically, where the body loses the ability to undertake certain processes which need thiamine, massive doses can be needed to stimulate those activities. Okay, now this is what Lonsdale said all along. Lonsdale theorized why some people need absolute megadoses of thiamine is because enzymes become downregulated. Proteins, transporters, which get thiamine into cells, become downregulated. And kind of what he theorized was that megadoses are necessary to wake them up, to kind of shock them into production. It takes a while, but until you've got enough of this kind of enough thiamine there, then the processes they don't work as they should do.
Right.
What I would say is my position, and we have discussed this, me and Lonsdale as well, and Chandler Mars, of course.
Right.
My position
I'm very
is slightly
interested in your perspective of this, but let me just say something. This also happens with many compounds in the human body. So some vitamins and minerals don't do anything up until a certain point, and then they reach that tipping point. After which they just do, and we also see this in LDN, for example, right? Low dose naltrexone. So the effect is just totally different than dosing a reasonable dose of the compound, and the effects are profoundly different. But what's your take on this? I'm very interested in your vision of this problem.
Yeah, well, basically, when you look at some of the evidence, and this is, again, it's based on limited data because no one really knows. There's lots that we don't know.
Right.
There's a couple of theories for why high doses of thiamine will work, and that's various researchers have indicated, like non-coenzyme roles. But one of the things that I find very interesting is that if we look at some of the conditions which respond to B1, one of those being Parkinson's, what they found is that, like we were talking about, this region of functional deficiency in the organ, what they found is that in certain regions or certain cells in the brain, for instance, you end up with various kind of toxins, particularly in Parkinson's. You have these neurotoxins which have been associated with the disease. But you also have lots of other toxins, modern day toxins, industrial chemicals, reactive oxygen species, nitric oxide, peroxynitrite, inflammatory compounds, heavy metals, all of these things which a lot of people who are sick have come into contact with and they can't get rid of. Well, these tend to have an effect on how the cells make energy. What they do is they can either bind onto enzymes. For those who aren't familiar, the way that we're basically generating energy in the form of ATP is we're taking, substrate, fat, glucose, and we're running that through various kind of cycles, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain, etc. And basically this involves lots of different enzymes. You convert one thing into another thing, into another thing, into another thing. Now, to make energy, you need all of those processes working as they should do. Now, unfortunately, what you find is that, like I was saying before, these toxins, what they do is they inhibit those enzymes. They can block them, they can deactivate them, they can stop the cofactor from binding them. Now, something to consider is that all of these enzymes need nutritional cofactors to work properly. You need iron, you need CoQ10, you need B3, B2, right. All of these, zinc, for instance, B6. Now, here's where it really, really gets interesting, is that those enzymes, you have certain enzymes which are called rate limiting enzymes. What that basically means is that when they slow down, every other step behind them or in front of them also slows down. So you've got one called alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase. You've got another one called pyruvate dehydrogenase. Both of these are really critical rate limiting enzymes. That means that if they shut down, if they slow down, then all of the other processes also shut down. And actually the cell can't generate energy. Now, if you look at what the cell, like to remain healthy, a cell needs energy. And when a cell doesn't have energy, it gets sick or gets damaged. So
by the way,
concept
we can assess the performance of this cycles in a node test. True?
Debatable. I think, yeah, you get a lot more information. I don't know if you can tell if someone has a functional deficiency in a certain part of the brain.
Right.
I'm not convinced that they can do that.
Yeah, I'm not.
Or even in an organ. I think, it's picking up on systemic levels.
Right.
Yeah. So I think even that has its limitations, but it's positive. It's definitely better than, conventional medical testing.
Right.
That's for sure. Yeah. But so these enzymes, they become blocked by toxins. Now, the rate limiting enzymes, as I just discussed, don't want to labor the point. Well, it turns out that these rate limiting enzymes, which are extremely sensitive to toxins, both of them are dependent on thiamine. Okay. In fact, thiamine is capable of determining whether they continue moving or whether they stop working. So there are genetic conditions of people who have defects in making these enzymes. And the only way in which those people survive is by giving megadoses of B1. Now, the concept is that when an enzyme is either genetically determined to be poor at binding with thiamine, or alternatively, you've got something which is inhibiting that enzyme, is blocking that enzyme. The concept, which I personally believe to be true, I think this is what's happening, is that if people have underlying toxicity, they have heavy metal toxicity, they've got this problem where they've got enough thiamine coming in their diet. But the problem is that it's the enzymes are gummed up, the enzymes are blocked.
And let me try to guess what your idea is. As B1 is going to stimulate the enzyme so much that there's a tipping point where even the underlying toxicity and the damage, the quote unquote damage that the toxin is creating, B1 is going to surpass that by overly activating the enzyme. Is that what you think that happens?
That's what I think the evidence suggests. Yeah, it's a similar concept, right. Is that enzymes becoming blocked. Well, what can you do about that? You can use what has been used in conventional medicine for the genetic conditions, stimulating those enzymes with megadoses. You can bypass that inhibition. Now, that doesn't fix the heavy metal toxicity, because heavy metal toxicity is going to cause lots of problems, right. But it can address that one element of heavy metal toxicity, which actually is probably really significant, because if a cell can't generate energy, then,
it cannot detox. It's actually going to be, it's actually going to be beneficial for the heavy metal toxicity problem as well, right? Yeah. For the detox processes to happen and for the enzymatic detox to happen. Wow, very, very interesting. And so there's the original question was, why do you think that B1 is helpful in so many of the chronic conditions that we have today? And the answer would be that it has the effect. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the answer is it has the effect to overstimulate some of the enzymes that are crucial to generate energy, even if there's problems going on, there's underlying toxicity or potentially other deficiencies as well, right? And B1 can essentially surpass that and overcome the problem by over stimulation. Right.
I think that's the case. And it applies to the other vitamins and minerals as well.
That's the megadose, by the way, right? That's the need for the megadose.
That's correct. And it applies to other nutrients, but the reason why I think B1 is so significant is because the enzymes for which it is a cofactor are rate limiting. Okay, so you can have inhibition of other enzymes and there are adaptations, but when you inhibit pyruvate dehydrogenase, you ain't going to be burning glucose. You can't burn glucose. Yeah. You end up recycling it via lactate, and that is, in other words, Warburg metabolism, right? That's similar, or it can eventually turn to that, and that's one of the reasons for the interest in B1's relationship with cancer as well, and using high doses for addressing the kind of metabolic block that you find in cancer on pyruvate dehydrogenase.
Wow. Yeah, that's logic.
That's one theory at least. There's other theories that if someone has a problem with transporting B1 into the cells, there are genetic problems. Maybe there's toxins, maybe there's inflammatory effects whereby people can't actually get enough B1 into their cells. So the concept is using high doses can actually
saturate the space. Right.
Saturate the space, saturate the gut with it, get it into the bloodstream. Again, you've got these saturable transporters in the gut. They can be downregulated in inflammation, for instance. So again, it's kind of saturating the body with as much as possible. But I don't think that can really explain why there's a tipping point, why there's this kind of lucky number for certain people. I think it has to do with enzymes,
both, right?
Maybe. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So what is the, just out of curiosity, what's the transporter for B1 to go inside the cell? What's the name
So
of it?
so you've got a couple. They're abbreviated. Thiamine transporter 1, thiamine transporter
Okay.
2,
Right.
but the exact gene is SLC19A3, and I think you've also got SLC19A2. You've also got is it OTC1 maybe? There's a couple of different ones. It's not OTC. Sorry, I'm mixing it up with oxalate. There's a couple of different carriers which can either get some of the thiamine derivatives. So that would be free thiamine into the cell, but then you also have transporters for thiamine monophosphate, thiamine triphosphate. You have like reduced folate carrier, which can actually pump thiamine out of the cell. There's various
And
different
could a
ones.
genetic test in this case provide a hint for deficiency or malfunctioning in the transporters themselves?
Well, for perhaps now, a lot of the SNPs have not been very well identified. Here's the thing:
Right. Yeah.
if you have a genuine like defect, then that will be diagnosed probably early at birth. You can have thiamine transporter dysfunction, which causes thiamine responsive megaloblastic disease. Anemia, you've got thiamine biotin responsive basal ganglia disease. And here's the other thing, because biotin, there's an interesting paper, and basically other nutritional cofactors might also affect our ability to transport thiamine into the cell. You've got biotin, which is responsible, or which seems to be necessary for the expression of the thiamine transport protein. And there was one study showing that mild biotin deficiency, one of the first proteins which was downregulated was the thiamine transport protein. So again, it could be that someone has a biotin defect, which then turns into a thiamine defect, because a mild biotin deficiency, which turns into a problem transporting thiamine to the cell, where you end up with an induced thiamine deficiency because of a biotin problem. Again, it's just not been very well researched. There's no solid answers on this, you know?
Right. Yeah, it's just a matter of experimenting, I think, and just trying to find what works, basically. So what about complex chronic conditions like we were talking about? Could like conditions like mold illness and Lyme be sometimes confused with B1 deficiency or functional deficiency? Or do you think that sometimes giving high doses of B1 to patients of Lyme disease and mold illness would actually have a positive impact, not because there's this deficiency, but because of this concept that we were talking about, that B1 sometimes overly stimulates some of the enzymes that eventually mask the symptoms, if you will?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it works both ways, and I've seen it work both ways. Okay. So the Lyme mold, again, those two conditions, highly complex, or I'll say co-infections, Lyme co-infections,
right,
with mold, or I'll call it CIRS.
Yes.
Not necessarily just mold, but it can be any of the kind of organisms.
Can lead to SIRS, definitely.
Yeah, which lead to SIRS. So if you've got these two individual kind of, all these areas that kind of connected, there is a lot of overlap in terms of symptomatic presentation. Okay, so some people can read the videos and stuff that I do. They look at the articles and they see the signs and symptoms, and actually they see that they've got autonomic nervous system dysfunction and whatnot. They think they've got a thiamine problem. Actually, it turned out that they had mold Lyme. I had many people come to me. They say, "Oh, I've tried thiamine, I've tried this, I've tried that," and actually, it turned out they have Lyme co-infections or mold. So they look very similar in terms of the symptoms, and that's kind of really confusing sometimes for some people. So Lyme, mold, thiamine deficiency, they can look very similar, and you seem to have two camps, right? For some people, it tends to be the case that they respond beautifully to Lyme, to thiamine treatment, along with some other kind of anti-neuroinflammatories and things, even if they have ongoing Lyme, especially if they have post-Lyme, but also if they have a mold problem, because sometimes I think that if you look at the neuroinflammatory processes that are caused by mold or Lyme, then ultimately it's producing the same chemicals which have this effect on metabolism. Now, if you look at some of the kind of mold specialists, like Shoemaker or Andrew Heyman, for instance, they've commented that, you know, in a mold patient, what they can see is that whilst you've got these inflammatory genes which are being expressed, and they've got this neuroinflammation, what there also is present of is hypometabolism in the brain. So you've got this inability or this defect in making energy. Now, the question is this purely a cell danger response whereby it's suitable or it's preferential not to make energy? Does it benefit them? Or alternatively, is it a downstream detrimental side effect that they get from chronic neuroinflammation? And actually, does fixing the energy problem help them deal with the inflammatory problem, right? And it seems to be, I'll be honest, it seems to work in both directions. Some people, it seems as though if they've treated Lyme, if they've got out of a moldy environment, but if they've still got this kind of chronic neuroinflammation and autonomic nervous system dysfunction, then for them, sometimes it is a case of actually stimulating metabolism, starting to open up those energy generating pathways. And so the brain can actually start clearing the waste. And in some people, they recover from what they thought was post-Lyme syndrome. It was actually like a collection of nutritional deficiencies which were induced by chronic infection, even though they dealt with chronic infection. Now, that also applies to some people who are in a moldy environment, who have current borreliosis or current Lyme disease. So I would never rule it out. However, what I would say is that for some people, it's the opposite. And so, you know, I try not to, although some people get the impression that, you know, I think everyone should take megadoses of B1, that I categorically don't. I think that they should trial it out because I don't think that there's many risks involved, long-term genuine risks. What I would say, though, is that I have many people with SIRS or with Lyme or with mold or, you know, kind of a collection of those kind of conditions who take anything which stimulates energy metabolism, they get worse. Right. And I think that this does potentially relate to Navio's theory of the cell danger response, and that if the cells are stuck in this like battleship mode, then when you stimulate anything you take, which is designed to kind of stimulate the process of oxidative phosphorylation, it ends up just generating. Exactly. This is especially true if someone's got defective mitochondria as well, right? Exactly. For people who are damaged by drugs, for instance, right? You've got someone who has ciprofloxacin reaction, fluoroquinolines, right? It could be even metronidazole, any of these drugs which cause, you know, widespread mitochondrial damage. What I would say is, you know, if you stimulate damaged mitochondria, what is potentially going to happen is they're going to spew out a bunch of reactive oxygen species. You're going to get massive amounts of oxidative stress and you're going to feel terrible, right? In that case, what you might actually want to focus on doing is, for the people who have very damaged mitochondria, try to initiate some kind of protocol which is aimed at maximizing mitophagy, you know, then maximizing mitochondrial biogenesis, fasting, all of this stuff essentially designed to clear out. Yeah, the stuff designed to clear out defective mitochondria. And then what you might find is a couple of months down the line, actually, when you've got new mitochondria, then you can stimulate that and it works way better. On the other hand, if you've got someone with active mold or active Lyme, then what you could potentially be looking at is that they're stuck in this cell danger response. They might not have severely damaged mitochondria per se, but it might be the case that you need to remove the threat. And the threat, until you remove that threat, until you remove, you know, the mycotoxins or whatever it is, or you calm down that inflammatory response, anything which stimulates metabolism is potentially going to make someone feel 10 times worse. And so that is a caveat, which I think many of the people who come to my kind of information on thiamine, they are still stuck in that position. And that's one of the reasons why, even if they do have the symptoms, even if they are deficient, even if they're candidates at some point in the future, they're not candidates for high-dose thiamine therapy right now.
Right. Very, very interesting. And we have, I think that part of the people who listen to this podcast may have Lyme, may have mold, and they have certainly experienced boosting their metabolism and ending up worse. I myself did that. At a certain point, I tried to boost the metabolism, and I got worse. And I couldn't figure out why. So this is really interesting. Also, you said that there are risks in megadosing B1 long term. I will probably touch on that later on in specific questions that I have here. But for the sake I actually wrote it down because I would love to discuss that. Hi, enjoying this podcast? Know that a lot more are going to follow, so please make sure to subscribe to the channel. And also, if you have suggestions on guests to invite to this podcast, leave them down below. Also, I would like to know if you have any particular question regarding this podcast, and if you have any particular comment or remark on this discussion, please do let me know in the comments down below, and let's get back to it. Okay, awesome. So we talked actually about this before the podcast started because I had this question in my mind and I wanted to clear it out, which is B1 being a thiol. And this connects to thiol sensitivity. My previous guest, Dr. Boyd Haley, the creator of VOSR, we discussed this and how molybdenum can help with thiol sensitivity. But the question here would be if it is always a thiol, if it depends on the form of B1, and whether thiol sensitive people would actually get worse from megadosing B1 because of the thiol sensitivity in the first place.
Yeah, so I'm not convinced of like any valid reason to assume that taking thiamine would increase the kind of total content of thiols in the body. The thiamine molecule, it doesn't contain an SH group. Now, there's reason to say, like in a petri dish, thiamine can convert into an open ring kind of thiol form temporarily. Now, it's not known whether that occurs or how much that occurs or whether that's even relevant in like inside the human body. One of the ways in which bacteria, if you have bacteria which produce thiamine degrading enzymes, it can be that you're generating kind of the thiol form of thiamine temporarily. Again, I don't know how relevant that is to physiology. I personally have found that the only people who have problems, or the only form of thiamine that people with what we'll refer to as thiol sensitivity or sulfur sensitivity. The only people that I found who the only form that I found people respond negatively to are the disulfide or the sulfur, the derivatives, sulbutamine and thiamine tetrahydrofurfuryl disulfide, because those TTFD. TTFD. They do yield a thiol, and it's likely, I mean, the TTFD mercaptan. Right. Basically, so when you break down,
benfotiamine would be probably the safest bet, right?
Yeah, well, benfotiamine or thiamine HCl. Yeah, right. one of those forms would likely be the safest bet.
But that being said, anybody who was sulfur sensitive and did have this problem and then switched the form and all of a sudden the problem went away? Did you actually got to see that?
Yeah, I've seen that countless times. Yeah, indeed. Okay. People who have issues with sulfur, generally, if they take TTFD, I mean, there's two types of people as well, though, because there's people who think they have a problem with sulfur or thiol sensitivity, and they take TTFD and it fixes their problem. Right. So that's another caveat, which is kind of really confusing. Right. But ultimately, not all sulfur sensitivity is the same, like, honestly. And sometimes molybdenum fixes any intolerance to TTFD or sulbutamine as well. Yes. So it can be really quite a simple fix of taking something else that can also help the sulfur sensitivity to TTFD or sulbutamine is taking NAC, which is kind of like bizarre. You would think that, okay, well, NAC being a thiol, precisely.
It is anyway, going to make somebody worse, not better.
Yeah. Right, but for the people who are generally very, very have lots of problems in that area, then usually benfotiamine or thiamine HCl fixes the problem. Got it. There's always people who take thiamine and they have reactions and they put it down to some reason, but oftentimes I think it's sometimes very difficult to know why someone's not responding to something. I would say that there's lots of other like more realistic reasons, or probably more likely reasons for someone reacting to thiamine HCl or benfotiamine, instead of them reacting to the thiol, the theoretical thiol content of it, because it doesn't even contain a thiol, the molecule. Right. So that's what I would say in that regard. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. The reason why I asked this is because I want to try to megadose B1 myself. and being thiol sensitive. Actually, I bring a lot of these questions that I would like to experiment on myself. Same thing with the last podcast. I brought Dr. Boyd Haley to the podcast. And actually, and apparently for you, so that you know, OSR is capable of reversing thiol sensitivity once someone goes through 20 grams of the compound. Now, the problem is that OSR is not legal in the market. Dr. Haley is still running clinical trials that FDA requires to approve the compound, but there's a lot of anecdotal evidence saying that and again, we have the same curious thing. OSR is itself a dithiol compound, and it reverses apparently, or it helps a lot with thiol sensitivity. This is really interesting stuff. But the main reason sometimes, because the audience may ask why do you ask these questions and whatnot. Some of these questions are actually I'm a little bit selfish, and I bring the guest over to ask questions that I would like to know the answer for, and this is precisely one of them. So I would like to megadose B1. I'm a thiol sensitive guy, and therefore I'm thinking about going with benfotiamine because it is the safest bet, I would say. So next set of questions in your guide, and by the way, I'll leave the guide down here. So for anyone listening to this who would like to know the protocols for dosing B1 for certain health conditions, and all of this that we've been talking about and more, Elliot devised a guide, a so-called guide that he has on his website. I've looked through it, I've studied it. It is magnificent information, and I would suggest everyone to take a look. The link is going to be here, also for the website in general, but directly to the guide if you would like to know more about thiamine deficiency and how to use it, how to dose it, and whatnot. And Elliot, in that document, also describes the paradoxical reaction to B1, which briefly, if I got it right, you may be deficient in B1, you take B1, but actually the symptoms get a little bit worse before they get better. So sort of an Alzheimer reaction, where you have this slowdown of, or actually worsening of symptoms before they get better. And Elliot does a great job explaining why this happens, but let's assume the paradoxical reaction and talk a little bit more about this. So I've myself, the first time that I megadosed B1, and it was not such a high megadose, it was about half a gram, if I remember correctly, perhaps 750 milligrams at most. I've myself experienced sleepiness. And this is actually not one of the symptoms listed in the paradoxical reaction, but I would say that you listed the most common ones, and you assume that there may be more. So could you consider this sleepiness throughout the day, actually after lunch primarily, but not connected to insulin resistance or any of that? I've got that under control. Could this be considered a symptom worsening in the rationale of paradoxical reactions by supplementing B1 as you typically described, due to the increased requirement of other nutrients such as potassium, as you also explain in the document?
Okay, first of all, yes, sleepiness is one of them. I have to think exactly what symptoms I put down in the document, but I'll add sleepiness to it. It's a growing document, so
right,
you know, yeah, sleepiness is one of them. Really, any new odd symptoms or worsening of any current symptoms, you know, any symptom can be really part of the paradoxical effect. And I'd just like to also kind of articulate that it's a theory. What I've laid out is a theory for why the paradoxical effect happens. Like, no one really knows. Lonsdale believes it's a shift from catabolic physiology to anabolic physiology. I mean, like, no one really knows. What I'd say, I mean, the Japanese even documented it back, 50 years ago, documenting that people usually get worse before they get better. However, what I would say is that clinically, you can oftentimes mitigate, or you can reduce the amount of effects that someone has using other nutrients. And what that suggests to me really is that it does involve some kind of an increased requirement or some kind of an imbalance that is occurring with the other associated nutrients. I think that is clear.
Right.
And two of the key things are going to be magnesium, and I have personally found is potassium is massive. And I think that, you know, anyone knows if they've taken massive doses of methyl B12 or other methylation related nutrients, is that actually the potassium requirement can go significantly up. And when someone's low on potassium, because you're increasing cell division, you're increasing kind of, you know, the production of basically molecules which you need to build up cells, you're using a ton of potassium. And that's what I think might happen with people with B1, is when they're taking high B1, they move, they start building stuff up, they're becoming more anabolic, let's say. I think what's happening is they're using up a lot of their raw material and increasing the requirement for it. That's one thing. Also, another thing is that when you have these cycles, again, when you're making energy, you think of it like cogs, wheels, you know, right. Multiple different cogs. When you start driving or spinning one, you need to spin the others. And that means that you've got an increased requirement for lots of different things downstream. So it's really difficult to kind of isolate those things without, Absolutely. You know, doing testing and things. But overall, the paradoxical effect, it tends to be the case that even if it's very mild, people usually do get worse before they get better. One other thing that you did mention before, which also can happen, is they can get better before they can get better, and then they get worse, and then they get better, and then they get worse. There's really no rhyme or reason to it. It's generally a change in symptoms quite dramatically. Sometimes it can be mild, but usually it's negative, and then it balances out, and then it gets worse or it gets better, and then it balances out, and then, you know, so on and so forth, until someone finds kind of like the sweet spot and the dose that works for them.
Right. You actually answered the following question that I had, which is, I believe that at least at first, right after you megadose B1, where you start megadosing B1, the two most required nutrients or minerals in this process would be magnesium and potassium, but you already said yes to that. The other question that I had for controlling the potassium, which is actually something that you brought up when you started, when you talked about the very condition, is the regulation of blood pressure. So would blood pressure be a good indicator for controlling potassium in this case? So let's assume we are megadosing B1, we get sleepy, perhaps we don't know what nutrient we are actually missing as a result of megadosing B1. Would looking at blood pressure and the fact that it came down, or it actually went up in this case, be an indicator that actually potassium is what we need to supplement right after?
It's possible, but what I would also say is that there's lots of things which can increase blood pressure, which aren't necessarily a potassium issue, right? For instance, you know, Lonsdale studied this in children, you know, thousands of children, and the way that he laid it out in Chandler Mars in their book together, many a case study, the way that he laid it out was that sometimes the nervous system can do funny things. It can do strange things. We spoke about how you can have like a problem with the communication from the brain to the rest of the organs when you got a problem with thiamine deficiency. Okay. That includes the blood pressure. So one of the things that I often see in people is chronically low blood pressure. Chronically low blood pressure for no apparent reason, and thiamine can address that. Okay. But here's the interesting thing.
It has nothing to do with potassium most of the time.
Well, I mean, these are people
who be, right? Yeah.
It might be. It might relate to potassium, but it might be secondary. Yeah. I mean, the potassium might be secondary to more of an issue with actually the brain telling the cardiovascular system how, you know, the blood vessels to constrict, to dilate, etc. That's often a problem. So what I would say is that what Lonsdale found very interestingly was that in some people, if they had low blood pressure, for instance, you could take thiamine, and all of a sudden, as part of their paradoxical reaction, they would develop high blood pressure. Or alternatively, it would be the opposite. Same with stomach acid. For instance, someone might have chronically low stomach acid, and then all of a sudden take thiamine,
and all of a sudden they
get it really high
or something. Right.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's like almost like the brain comes back online, the nervous system starts communicating information, and sometimes it starts misfiring. It's like, okay, fire a lot on one day, and then you might go another day where it's not firing at all, and you go back to low stomach acid or low blood pressure. So I would say that I don't know if that would be a surefire way to assess. What I would say is that if someone doesn't have like an underlying cardiovascular condition or is taking a medication which would prevent them from taking any potassium or electrolytes, what I would personally, experiment with, again, like I lay out in the document, the kind of symptoms that often present with a potassium deficiency, that's one thing, or a lack of potassium. And I would say, try adding very high potassium foods. That might be coconut water, that might be certain other things.
Potatoes, right?
Yeah, but really, in many cases, I find that those aren't all that sufficient. I would say actually taking a form of potassium, maybe an electrolyte powder, high potassium electrolyte, or even just potassium citrate, something like that. Taking it with food.
Right. I actually like to sprinkle potassium citrate on my food, and it actually tastes good. You were saying something that made me remember a story with a friend. He wasn't feeling great on that day, and he told me, I had a flare up in my digestive issues. And then I started to feel very weak, but I went and I measured my blood pressure, and it was very low. And I thought it was adrenals, he said. And my theory at that point, which then became more clear or more, valid after, talking about it for a while, was that the digestive system and the brain, there was a miscommunication because of the problems in the digestive system. And so the brain couldn't really tell the body to have or in this case, the heart, to have the blood pressure that was supposed to be. And you just said the same. B1 can cause this, like lack of B1 or too much B1. It seems that the body may have been stuck in a state where it couldn't, like the brain couldn't tell the body that, blood pressure has to be higher. And all of a sudden it could, and it just said it, all at once. And then blood pressure just went through the roof. So it's really, I think that the guide does a great job of explaining, the things that may happen and come up with an explanation for that. So it's really, I think if there is one thing that popped out at the end of reading the guide, is someone doing some experiment with megadosing B1 should really at least have this guide with them. Otherwise, it's too much of a roller coaster to infer actually what's going on. And it may actually be a little bit dangerous at the end of the day. Or just, too much trial and error, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, it's time consuming. It takes like a lot of education. There's not really many people who know what to do. I mean, that's the unfortunate thing. And there's not, I mean, it's as you know, it's a massively under-acknowledged, not very well-known topic, even in alternative medicine circles. So there's not many people who even know anything about this. What I would say about kind of long-term safety, I'm convinced that it's safe long-term. What people can experience is a worsening of symptoms. That doesn't necessarily mean that the B1 is causing them like a genuine medical problem, but it can throw out other nutrients. And I think that, in terms of like safety, I want it to be known that there's no medical reason to consider this is unsafe. There's no genuine toxicity that occurs or anything like that. From a more functional perspective, though, and this is, what I think applies to a lot of people with chronic illness, is that from a functional perspective, in terms of their kind of symptom progression and their recovery from disease, it can set some people back slightly. I find it less common indeed, but it can. And I think it does definitely seem to have a very kind of, there's a lot of nutritional interactions that I think need to be taken into consideration before someone starts this kind of a thing. And taking a megadose of B1, really high dose, all of a sudden, without doing your homework, is really not a good idea. It's
Yeah.
really not a good idea. And I learned the hard way. And unfortunately, some of my clients also learned the hard way in the early days, because I would just kind of, be gung ho and say, oh, yeah, take this, take that, take that. And it made a lot of people worse, and they couldn't deal with the paradoxical effect of it all. Now I take a much more conservative approach and go very slowly. As you see on the document, I recommend going super slow. And hitting all of the bases as well. And I often find when you do that, actually someone can tolerate the nutrient, and they can actually benefit marvelously. I've had some people who said that they tried B1 and they, they kind of felt terrible for a couple of days or something, and they completely decided that they weren't going to touch it again. And then they became interested. They bought that protocol, and actually they found that now they can tolerate it using all of the kind of information in there contained within it. So that's what it was designed to do.
And I think you did a great job at that. So exploring this risks of megadosing B1 a little bit more, my first guest of the podcast, Dr. Russell Jones, he theorizes that B2 is actually riboflavin, is actually the central vitamin at methylation, for instance. If B2 is not active and present in the body at sufficient levels, then nothing really is going to work. And he also said to me at some point, I think that this was off the podcast, if I remember correctly. He told me that you shouldn't take more B1 than you take B2, because then you're going to offset B2 levels, because there is this dependency. And so if you want to megadose B1, be my guest, but you must megadose B2 as well. I don't think you agree with this, or that you have the exact same vision. But the idea here would be, if I decide to megadose, and of course that this is not medical advice, nothing on this podcast is medical advice, I didn't say this, but yet. But if I want to megadose B1, and I'm still concerned about the B2 effect, for instance, on methylation, would you see this as a problem? Like, I keep B2 at 50 milligrams, for instance, and I go 1,800 milligrams of B1 over time?
Yeah. Okay. So, no, I disagree with that. I disagree with the concept that you need equal amounts, that you need to megadose both. Now, I guess it also comes down to definition. So what is a definition of megadose riboflavin? Would that be, 800 milligrams if you're taking 800 milligrams of thiamine? Well, I'm not sure what the rationale for that would be. I'd be open to discussion, but ultimately the way that I see things is that if people have the need to take such a high amount of B1, the likelihood of right. Okay. So first of all, if we consider what B1 is actually doing in the cell, okay, oftentimes I think in many cases, the benefit is not even coming from stimulating enzymes. Okay. I think sometimes it's non-coenzyme, maybe genetic effects, epigenetics. We don't know. So there's probably a portion of that B1 that is going to be kind of, affecting other processes in the cell. But let's say that what it is doing is it's stimulating the rate at which which enzymes work. Okay. So for the enzymes which require B1 to work, for instance, pyruvate dehydrogenase, alpha ketoglutarate dehydrogenase, they also require FAD, okay, or FADH2, which is a derivative of riboflavin, right? It's the active derivative of riboflavin, active B2. So what are you going to surmise that? Okay, so if we take 800 milligrams of thiamine, then that's going to speed up the rate of that enzyme by 800 times. If we've got the RDA, which is 1 milligram, and then we've got 800 milligrams, does that mean that it's going to speed it up 800 times? No, it doesn't work like that. It's not like you can't quantify it in that way. So it's like the maximum that you need in the body, like coming in per day to prevent a deficiency, severe deficiency of thiamine, is 1 milligram. For riboflavin, what is it like? I get mixed up between, is 5 milligrams Is it 2
Yeah,
milligrams?
I'm not sure. I think it is a little bit more, but I would probably say 2 if I had to
No,
guess.
no. Actually, no. So it's 1.1 milligram per day. 1.1 milligram or 1.3 milligrams. I mean, it's tiny, right? It's tiny. So I'm interested in what is the proposed relationship that thiamine has with riboflavin that would justify using an equal amount, because I don't know of any direct effect by which thiamine, which I mean, based on the logic that if you're speeding certain things up in the cell by taking the amount of thiamine, then you would also need equal parts riboflavin. Well, then in that case, you would also need equal parts niacin, equal parts alpha lipoic acid.
Yeah. That was actually the next question. So, assuming that even if we megadose B2, whatever that means for B2, because we are megadosing B1, then we would still have the problem for other B vitamins and other nutrients in general, right?
Yeah, and this is the thing, right? So this is why I don't agree that if you megadose one B vitamin, it necessarily means that you're going to induce a deficiency if you're not taking an equal dose, right? Because I don't think.
But do you agree that we should up the other B vitamins if we megadose one?
Yeah, indeed. And that's the concept behind like a very basic protocol would be to consume a B complex.
Right.
Now, here's the thing. Most B complexes contain around 50 times the amount that you get from food. It's 50 times. That's a massive amount, especially for the forms that you actually absorb quite a lot of.
Yeah.
So first of all, can you even absorb like 800 milligrams of riboflavin? Highly doubt it. If you're using the derivatives of thiamine, yes, you can. You can absorb like that amount in a day very easily. So the chances are, like, even if you megadose a form of riboflavin, chances are
the whole amount.
You're not going to absorb the whole amount. There's not derivatives like there are for thiamine. Right. And also, if we've got this concept of enzymes being blocked by certain things, like it doesn't necessarily, I guess what I'm trying to get at is I don't know how one would justify needing equal parts.
Any logical reason for it.
What I would say is that there is some evidence to suggest that thiamine can cause increased urinary excretion of riboflavin. The derivatives didn't do that. So benfotiamine and TTFD, but thiamine HCl does. So it does seem to increase urinary excretion of riboflavin. And of course, you could surmise that, okay, what likely happens is speeding up cellular processes increases the demand. But when you're giving 50 times the RDA, like that is going to be sufficient, yeah.
So in principle, if we decide to megadose B1, taking a B complex is wise, is necessary, and it's also enough in theory.
Yes. And I mean, that's the case for the vast majority of people. Now, that being said, there's always some kind of individualization. So if a B complex only provides 15 milligrams of riboflavin, let's say, or 5 milligrams of B6, like, my B complex does, then someone might actually require a higher amount depending on their individual symptoms. But
of course, it would depend on the exact B complex we're talking about. But in general, as long as we are talking about a reasonable B complex or an average B complex, that would, in your vision, be sufficient to cover for the increasing needs of other B vitamins when megadosing B1, right?
Yeah, indeed. There's some doctors which would even say that you don't need to take a B complex.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's Constantinium one.
Yeah.
I don't agree with that, but there's people who can take thiamine who don't take the other Bs.
Right. So the B complex actually, like you said, we may not be absorbing the entire amount of other B vitamins that we supplement with. I think that I'm also a little bit afraid of this because over the years I've had a lot of anecdotal evidence online of other people saying that they decided to megadose one B vitamin and they became deficient in the other ones, or they were trying to solve methylation with methyl B12, or anything else, and they imbalanced the whole B complex, and they were trying to figure it out, and it was complex, and so perhaps I became a little bit afraid of that. But your points are very good. Even if we were to megadose B2 because we megadose B1, we would not be absorbing the whole amount, most likely, of B2, because it's much more difficult to absorb B2 than B1, especially because B1, we have different forms. We can do benfotiamine, which is lipid absorbable, so or fat soluble. So then I came up with this idea. What about, instead of trying to megadose other B vitamins, just taking food that is especially high in B vitamins, like liver or bee pollen? Would this be a wise strategy to do when megadosing B1?
Some people do that. Some people try to do that. And for people who can't tolerate B complexes, they go ahead and do that. That's what they do. They eat liver. I've not come across bee pollen. I know it's not something that I know that much about, but nutritional yeast is a big one.
Right.
And again, it's pretty high in terms of the actual B content. Yeah, B vitamins across the board.
And are
so some people do that.
Able to offset the symptoms of the paradoxical reaction by taking that? What's your anecdotal evidence here?
Some people can continue taking high doses of high doses of thiamine with minimal extra nutritional supplemental support.
Right.
Sometimes no magnesium, sometimes no B complex, and the food seems to suffice. I would say the vast majority of people generally tend to feel worse if they don't have a B complex, even if they do eat a diet which is pretty rich in a lot of the B vitamins. And heavily consume foods which are high, liver, other organ meats, that kind of thing. There's arguments against that, but yeah, again, it's context dependent. I would caution against doing that. I really would. I would say that because thiamine doesn't. It can throw out other nutrients, but it's not something that we can quantify. We can't say how much it does that. So as a general rule, for lack of more detailed nutrient interactions and evidence of exactly how it's like affecting every other nutrient, I say the way to play it safe is generally to take a B complex. If that's a non-methylated B complex, if that's what helps one person, then I always say do that. If it's a low dose, do that. If someone likes a high dose active B complex, like methylated B complex, and that helps them, then by all means, they should do that as well. It's ultimately trial and error, I think, a lot of the time.
Loud and clear. Awesome. So let's talk briefly about the protocols, because this is another very long podcast already, and I'm afraid I'm taking too much of your time. So let's talk about the protocols. In your work, in your guide, that again, it's linked down below. And by the way, I didn't disclose this before, but Elliot does have a supplement company, and he has TTFD and a B complex for those who are wondering where they can find that. I'm also going to leave the links down below. So in your work and in your guide, you suggest that B1 can be highly important for some gastrointestinal conditions like low HCl, GERD, dysmotility. We talked about this in the podcast already. What is the actual connection between B1 and gut infections? Can you say something about that? Because I reckon that, well, I just read about it. I don't remember where and when, but I read that B1 can actually feed some gut infections that you may have. And at the time, it actually made sense to me. So would there be any contraindication in megadosing B1 if you have any kind of gut infection, or do you think it's actually useful to that end?
I've never come across anyone with gut infections having like an issue where their gut infection got worse from taking B1. I mean, generally any microbe I will say for the most part, that makes up the microbiome uses our nutrients, right? So that's our proteins, that's our fats, that's our carbohydrates, that's our B vitamins. I would say in terms of gut infections, what I'd be more concerned with is that if someone was eating a marginal amount and they already had some kind of a malabsorption and they had an infection or an abundance of a bug in the gut, which is known as a thiaminolytic bug, basically, which destroys thiamine. There's lots of kind of thiaminases which can be produced with enzymes which destroy B1. That's what would concern me more. Alternatively, the inflammation that's generated by infections affecting how well we're absorbing the food. I have never personally come across any evidence or any indication other than something in a lab study, in a petri dish, which says that, thiamine would increase the growth. And I mean, most nutrients increase the growth of a bug, for instance.
Any bacteria, right?
Yeah, I mean, like, how can you take that and say, "Oh, don't take this because actually this bug"?
It's how many infection worse?
Billions or trillions of bugs even live in our gut. I don't think anyone really knows like anything about the microbiome. People who try to say that you need to increase this bacteria and that bacteria, I think it's utter nonsense personally, and it's based on shabby data, which is essentially long-term epidemiological or observational data, which there's really no mechanistic evidence that it's like unless it's a genuine infection, no one has the knowledge to say, if you have this bacteria, you're healthy. And if you don't have this bacteria, you're not healthy. I think it's preposterous. It's, the whole research field is in its infancy at the moment. And I think that we need to be very cautious about making assumptions about what that evidence actually means, right? And whilst I think it's a fascinating area, I would say that I would be, it's easy to look at a research paper and say, oh, well, actually, this increased the growth of this. Therefore, I'm going to not take it. We don't know how much of it actually even gets to these bacteria. We don't know how much of it absorbs. We don't know how other bacteria or other microbes or yeast or whatever are gonna like process it before it even gets to that bug. So I would be, I just take that stuff for what it's worth. I don't know. I don't know, and I don't claim to know.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I actually believe that modulating the microbiome is a thing. I'm trying to do it myself. I do agree that the research field is really, really infant, but I believe that we can extrapolate some data already, and there are complex studies that show that particular strains should be present at certain amounts, and that people always present certain symptoms when they don't have specific bacteria under certain amounts. But I understand the controversy of this theme, of this subject, and I guess that's the bottom line. It is still very early days in this area, but also I believe that the connection between B1 feeding one particular infection, that would be way more of a stretch than just trying to modulate the microbiome. And at the end of the day, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was going to interject and look, I'm not trying to downplay the research at all. I think it's absolutely fascinating. And, I will spend hours reading the papers on the microbiome and the different species and things.
Right.
And clearly it plays a very important role in our health. Like that's for sure. But my concern is that there are assumptions based on dietary research. So determining what a nutritional or a healthy diet is based on the bacteria that it fosters the growth of in the gut, for instance. So for instance, my primary concern, and this is somewhat personal, but this is also, this is a clinical as well, is the evidence which is used by microbiome researchers to justify avoiding animal products in the diet. They will say, okay, well, red meat increases this bacteria, and then another study links this bacteria with this health condition. Yet when we're using, carnivorous diets clinically as a medicine for things like Crohn's disease,
right.
I have had so many people go into remission from their inflammatory autoimmune gut conditions and other conditions on a diet which has been purely animal foods.
Right.
Now, that is something, it happens a lot. And again, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that I recommend this diet for everyone. I think it's a clinical tool, but that is not substantiated in the microbiome research. And there seems to be major assumptions in the microbiome research, and that is extrapolated, I think incorrectly.
Yes.
They extrapolate that data and say, okay, this justifies the dietary guidelines, and this means that you will be unhealthy if you eat this diet. And that's what I don't agree with. So I'm not saying that we can't derive meaningful data, but I think that we,
I understand what you're saying. Well, perhaps I look at the microbiome as something in the long term, and definitely plays a major role in our health. I think that ultimately it has all to do with the microbiome. This is perhaps a very extreme vision of all of this, but we have 23,000 genes. Rice has 100,000. A grain of rice has 100,000 genes. So what is defining our complexity? It has to be the microbiome at the end of the day, in my view. And I think that the microbiome is really what modulates our health. But I understand that this may be a very controversial thing to say. Now, with that being said, I think that a lot of people are bound to the idea that one specific strain is really necessary, and you have to do this, otherwise you're going to hit your microbiome in an irreversible way. That is just BS, in my opinion. I think that we should take care of the microbiome in the long term. And I think that there are certain classes of bacteria, like bifidobacteria, they are proven that they feed off of gauze. And if we don't have gauze in our diets, nothing we will do is going to fix the deficiency of bifidobacteria that we have. That being said, I think that there are a lot of fanatics in this area that just say that you can do anything that is going to hit your lactobacilli or your bifidobacteria. And what you just said is the real proof of that. Carnivore diets work to bring down inflammation in various scenarios like Crohn's. They work beautifully for many people, and they are totally against what these people preach for a healthy microbiome in the long term. Now, I believe that all of this is extremely valid. I think that in the long term, we should be concerned about the microbiome. I think in the short term, we cannot ignore certain tools like a carnivore diet or something that is going to heat the microbiome, because we're going to lose a few strains of that. So I had this discussion with someone about antimicrobials, and that person, who is, in my opinion, a fanatic, told me, no, antimicrobials should be forbidden because you're going to kill your microbiome, you're going to wipe it off. And I don't think I think that everything should be taken in a reasonable amount. But I agree, this is an area that will see tremendous progress in the next decades and should be explored, because I do believe the gut microbiome has a major role in our health in general. So moving on, you also said that, I believe, that B1 can be used for gut hyperpermeability or leaky gut. What is the actual role of B1 in healing the gut?
Okay, so I guess it would depend on exactly what is causing the intestinal permeability to start with. Okay, so there is some interesting research done in animals. So particularly in the ruminants, thiamine is used as a protective agent against what's called ruminal acidosis, right? And of course, human beings don't have ruminants. We have completely different stomachs. But the mechanisms, interesting, the research team out of China at the moment, the researchers claim that the mechanism should still be the same in human beings, in that we've got, eukaryotic cells kind of thing. So what they found was that thiamine is capable, let's look in the context of a direct injury to the intestinal lining. Let's say someone has a gut infection. Let's say that they have a problem in that respect, and there's an inflammatory trigger. Let's say someone has a dysbiosis. Doesn't necessarily even have to be an infection per se, but they've got multiple kind of dysbiotic organisms, right?
Right.
So what you're going to end up with is a general influx of kind of pro-inflammatory molecules. One of those is going to be lipopolysaccharide, right? What often tends to occur, it seems, the kind of pathophysiology of intestinal permeability. Well, one of the things that can be driving that is this low-level chronic state of inflammation. Lipopolysaccharide can trigger kind of metabolic responses or changes in the way that cells signaling molecules and all that stuff, without going into the details, actually in the cells which make up the mucosal barrier, right? And one of the things that is involved in this respect is a downregulation of the production of proteins which make up like the gel, or they bind together the cells tightly. One of those is like claudin, you've got occludin, you've got zonulin.
Talking about the tight junctions, right?
Talking about the tight junctions.
Right.
Tight junctions, they're tight because proteins are basically binding them together.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Now, basically, chronic low-level inflammation can cause the cells of the intestine, or the colonocytes, the barrier cells, to essentially reduce the production of this protein. You end up with this gradual leakiness, opening up of the intestinal junction, right? So low-level chronic inflammation can do that. Now, in the context of using thiamine, well, thiamine has a somewhat of a medicinal anti-inflammatory property. And there was recent evidence which was showing that what it directly did was inhibited the effect that lipopolysaccharide had on producing inflammation in those cells. It addressed that what they call it was metabolic reprogramming. So it changed the state of cellular metabolism, and rather than cells being unable to properly make energy, they were generating sufficient amounts of ATP. And what ended up happening was the production of these proteins was normalized, even in the context of this health condition in these animals. And so it seems as though thiamine has direct effects on the metabolism of the cells which make up the intestine, which bind together the intestinal barrier. That's an important thing. It has anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties, but I don't think that this is the only way in which it works. I think it's primarily working through the vagus nerve, because the vagus nerve, of course, you've got site directed effects whereby cells are affected by inflammatory agents and toxins, and that can damage the intestinal barrier. But really, the intestinal barrier, I think that most of the control of it is actually coming from the vagus nerve, right?
Absolutely.
It is.
I mean, let me just say something real quick. And by the way, I love gut health. I'm really passionate about health, but the thing that I love the most is gut health. And I love vitamins. I love to. I'm enjoying this conversation way too much to put to words, but I love gut health. And I can tell you what, I tried to heal my leaky gut back in the day, and I used every single supplement under the sun for a leaky gut, and it didn't work. And I was puzzled why this doesn't work. Like, a lot of people are doing much less than I do and having much better results. And then I learned about the vagus nerve. If you are in a sympathetic tone all the time, you cannot heal your gut, period. Mm-hmm. That's my experience. I'm not saying that it is going to be true for everyone, but in my experience, you really have to induce that parasympathetic tone. And that's why gratitude is also very important to heal your gut. And that's why singing and just feel safe and feel loved and all those things impact the gut quite a lot. And so I do believe that the vagus nerve is really crucial or paramount in this process. So I saw the connection there, because we were talking about the brain and the PNS before, and the vagus tone. And I was actually anticipating the answer to this question, but that is not proven, right? So that's a theory. At least, I mean, it is proven, but indirectly. We don't know the exact mechanism that leads to that. Am I right?
No, we don't know the exact mechanism, but there's circumstantial evidence, there's anecdotal evidence, there's case reports. You know, I'm pretty convinced that it's having some effect on this tone. Yeah, I think it's improving vagal tone because, you know, vagus nerve is essentially it's like an on and off switch. It's like having a direct modulating or controlling effect on the entire enteric nervous system. And it's actually that nervous system which decides whether your gut is meant to be permeable or non-permeable. Sometimes gut permeability is actually useful in certain contexts, right? That's what I think is probably the case. If we have it there, it's there for a reason, right? So ultimately you should be able to control your gut permeability. And I think this is one of the reasons why people are so absolutely unsuccessful when it comes to healing leaky gut. If they use leaky gut protocols, you know, basically just taking things like aloe vera, L-glutamine, blah, 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 if they're not getting to the root cause of why it's leaky in the first place. And that's what I think is the key point, is that in some people it's leaky because they cannot control their entire nervous system, because they've got dysautonomia, because they've got autonomic nervous system dysfunction. So they develop food sensitivities, gut inflammation, chronic IBS, dysbiosis. And actually, if you look at dysbiosis, the bacterial composition of the gut can, in some cases, it seems to be related to the metabolism of the actual cells in the gut as well.
Absolutely,
so if you don't have good systemic metabolism, if you don't have good autonomic nervous system control, then you can't control your gut. I think a lot of the times, the people who go through these consistent gut focus protocols and killing protocols, whilst I think they certainly have their role and they deserve their spot.
But they're missing the point, right?
They miss the point, and I think it's, basically beating up a dead horse. Yeah, exactly. It's like if it didn't work a couple of times, chances are it's not going to work. So a lot of the people, I think one of the reasons why they're so over the moon when they come to my information, because they try it, they get better with it, and it's like, wow. It's not as though they've just randomly kind of developed this problem. It's that they've had this problem for 5 or 10 years. Right. And they've never been told it. And I think that's why they find the information so useful, is because they've failed for so long, because they've been led down this path to believe that everything begins in the gut. And if you fix the gut bacteria, then all of a sudden, everything else will get better. And in fact, whilst that does seem to be the case in some people, it seems as though taking a top-down approach and looking at the mechanism of control of the gut, which is what I like to focus on.
Yes.
It seems as though for some people that works. That is what their missing link was.
Exactly. Very insightful. Thanks. What about SIBO? We talked about this. So the main role of B1 would be, again, inducing a better vagal tone, but also acting as a prokinetic, right?
Yeah. So the digestive organs, I think if SIBO is caused by issues with actual digestive secretions, stomach acid, bile flow, digestive enzyme production, mucus, digestive mucus, then again, if that's caused by B1 deficiency, which all of those, like B1 deficiency can cause
it's
deficient,
present, right?
all of those things.
Right.
Then, of course, the mechanism is by which B1 helps that is by improving digestive secretion. However, what it does have an effect to do is somewhat of a pharmacological effect as well. Someone doesn't necessarily need to be deficient to get the prokinetic effects from different forms. The best form to stimulate motility is going to be TTFD. The research doesn't support it for thiamine, HCl, and benfotiamine. Now, here's the thing: if someone's
you mean that the research doesn't support, for instance, benfotiamine at all as far as the prokinetic?
Yeah.
Or you mean like there's less efficiency of benfo compared to TTFD, for instance?
No. So if someone's deficient, any form of thiamine, like if their gut issues are caused by an actual deficiency or dependence on thiamine,
right,
then any form should ordinarily address that. However, a lot of the times it doesn't. Some people respond well to benfotiamine. Most people get the benefit from TTFD,
right?
In terms of the gut. Now that's because TTFD has an interesting property that even if someone's not deficient, if the gut cells are blocked, so for instance, if the motility reflex is inhibited by a toxin or anything else, TTFD can counteract that. So there was research looking at all the different derivatives, and it was looking at basically if you poison an animal's intestine with what was it? It wasn't atrazine. It was, I can't remember what it was.
Some kind of toxin that would impair motility, right?
Exactly, right. And they looked at all the different thiamine derivatives. This animal was not deficient, by the way, all these animals. And what they did was they looked at all the derivatives. Thiamine had no effect. Benfotiamine had no effect. Other thiamine derivatives had no effect. The only thing that had an effect was TTFD. And TTFD restored motility to completely normal. It didn't produce diarrhea or anything like that. And here's the interesting thing as well.
Without detoxing the animal, right?
They weren't looking at detox or anything like that. They would just,
induced toxicity, and then they tested all the different forms of B1. TTFD was the only one that was able to restore motility even while the animal was toxic.
That's correct. But here's the other thing, is that they also did similar experiments in animals that weren't poisoned with it. And they found that TTFD did not stimulate motility. So animals that had normal motility, TTFD didn't stimulate motility.
So it's more of a modulating effect rather than
Yeah.
Right.
So it has a cholinergic effect. So I would say for the gut, TTFD is going to be better, although some people benefit from benfotiamine. Ultimately, it's acting on the colonic nervous. So the enteric nervous system, it's stimulating the production of acetylcholine, and it's the cholinergic action which stimulates contraction of the intestine. It doesn't work on the smooth muscle cells. It works directly on the neuron of the gut.
Right. That's super insightful. Thanks. And now I have this question. Among your clients, what kind of anecdotal evidence did you have that using TTFD over benfotiamine or the other way around was better to improve vagal tone?
It's entirely
both were efficient, equally efficient.
Yeah, I mean, look, both are very effective. Now, I personally have found TTFD to be slightly more effective in people who are kind of those irrecoverable cases. I've had people try massive doses of thiamine, HCl, massive doses of benfotiamine, it's not touched them. Whereas they take a high dose of allithiamine or Thiamax, TTFD, and it's the only thing which worked. Okay.
Right.
Now, I've not had that for people the other way around. That's the only reason why I favor TTFD. It seems as though in people who don't respond to any other form, TTFD can be the only one that helps them. That's not necessarily true for thiamine HCl, although I think it can be. In some people, it's just less common. Benfotiamine it's very good. I really like it. I think it's excellent. And in people who can't tolerate TTFD, by all means, benfotiamine is the next best thing. Yeah. It's the go-to, right? Without a doubt. And in fact, people who are very sensitive, they don't take TTFD. You know, I'm more than happy for them
straight to benfo.
To take benfo. But if someone has come to me and they've only tried benfo and they've still got issues with their gut and things like that, then I will put them on TTFD and it will usually work. Yeah. So that's why that's the only reason why I created TTFD, or why I started manufacturing it, was because there was no other form without any fillers, because people who are sensitive to foods generally, they also have sensitivity to other like supplement fillers.
Absolutely. I mean, we have to understand that these supplements are used in chronically ill people, and these people usually have all kinds of sensitivities going on, right? As far as neurological conditions, does B1 act both in the gut and in the brain? I think that we answered this throughout the podcast.
Yeah, I think it's working on every system.
Right. And how about chronic fatigue? I presume that you had a lot of clients approaching you because they had CFS. Is B1 primarily important as a metabolic booster or does it do more than this?
It would depend on whether that person is actually deficient. I've had some people who, and really, what is chronic fatigue? Is it just fatigued a lot of the time? Right. In that case, I've had many people who have who've benefit marvelously from taking high doses of B1. On the other hand, if they've got chronic fatigue syndrome, as in ME, as in, the collection that we were talking
Right.
about, SIRS, mold, Lyme
Yes.
co-infections. These people, B1 is usually not enough, right? Unless they've dealt with the infection and actually they're dealing with like runoff
The
effects.
toxins and whatnot.
It's usually not enough. It's usually a multi-pronged approach. But I think it's working similar concept, this idea that the cells, they're asleep, they can't make energy very well because their enzymes are blocked, or there's maladaptations. And I think that what can happen in that respect is that when you take high doses of B1, you're reawakening this system. You're starting to kickstart
The
glucose
metabolic
metabolism,
process.
metabolic processes. So it is a metabolic booster, not in the way that caffeine is, but in a way that actually something should be.
Right, exactly. But it could play other roles like anti-inflammatory roles and whatnot. Every single aspect of B1 would probably come into play in this condition, right?
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, there's numerous like non-enzymatic roles in terms of stimulating the production of antioxidants, activating NRF2. Benfotiamine has been shown to do that. It acts as like an NRF2 stimulator.
Right.
There's loads of these kinds of effects. So if someone benefits, it's difficult to say why they benefit, but we just know that they do.
Yeah, there's so many variables going around. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So we're approaching the end here, Elliot. One question that I ask most people is, what do you do, biohacks or not, in the support of your own health? I suppose that you use B1 yourself. I mean, you used it in the past. You're probably not using it now. You use it on and off. But what else do you do, biohacks or not, to support your own health?
Good question. I mean, I do take B1. Yeah, I do take a moderate dose. I take 100 to 200 milligrams per day, and then what's in a B complex as well. What else do I do? I like to take a dip in some cold water when that's possible. So I do like cold bathing. I like sauna again when I have the ability to do that. I like I regularly lift weights, although I had a bit of a 4-month hiatus from that this winter. But yeah, I like lifting weights in the gym, and following a diet which kind of somewhat resembles a human diet, something that's not completely, absolutely processed, ultra processed toxic junk. And I like trying to laugh, trying to find good comedy. I feel that there's so much darkness in the world that the only kind of way to deal with that is to find the satire in it all and see if you can have a joke about it.
Up. That's essential. Great to know. Awesome. Great to know you're taking care of yourself. Okay. I also learned that you're writing a book these days. When will the book be released?
That's a good question. Not sure yet. That's just the start of it. It's basically, it's trying to go through all of the research on all of these different conditions that respond to thiamine, the concept behind megadosing thiamine, evidence for it, evidence against it. I'm going to try make it as simple as possible to understand. I want it to be accessible to laymen. I don't want it to replace the wonderful book by Chandler Mars and Derek Lonsdale. In fact, I want it to supplement it. They've done an excellent academic text, which I think is perfect. But I believe that the information could be distilled into layman's terms and extra information added in a way that's very practical for people, as in, okay, I learned about this.
That most of your readers actually suffer from brain fog or cognitive issues. So it would make it easier for have the book in simple terms. Absolutely. Where can people find more about your work? So as far as the guide that we talked about, I will leave the link. I will also leave the link for your supplement company. What about any other, do you have a website or something that people can look up to?
Yeah, so my website is it's eonutrition.co.uk. So Elliot Overton is my name, eonutrition.co.uk. I am on Facebook as well. I regularly well, I say semi-regularly post things, if I find a new study, if I find something I'm interested in, if I want to draw a diagram to explain some kind of a process, what I will generally do is post that up on Facebook. I do have an Instagram and Twitter, which I don't use very frequently, but probably the best place to find me is YouTube, where I have lots of videos on thiamine. I have some videos on some other topics. And I also have a guide which we alluded to earlier on, and that's something that I made for people who come across my work, who want a consultation, but who I can't see at the moment. I'm not seeing anyone. So that is really for people who think they have a problem with thiamine processing. They think they have a thiamine responsive condition or a deficiency. They want to know how much to take, how much to start with. What condition they have is going to depend on what they need to take or what they might benefit from taking, and kind of how to navigate that whole process. Also, how to test, if they want to do some testing for other nutrients, how to interpret some basic markers on an organic acids test, for instance, how to interpret some basic markers on a blood count, on a comprehensive blood count, and what symptoms they might want to look at if they think that they're throwing out another nutrient. What I often see now, none of this is medical advice. It's ultimately just my experience and what I found, and it's generally got some pretty good feedback. So that's what really that's designed to do, and that can be found on my website as well.
Awesome. So I'll also leave the description to your, the link to your website in the description down below. Elliot, it was a true pleasure to be talking to you today. We took probably more than 2.5 hours, so this was quite of a stretch. I thank you so very much for your time and being here. And hopefully, who knows, in the future, I'll bring you once again to talk about oxalates. I would like to discuss that, since I didn't have the perfect timing to throw some oxalate questions into the game. But again, thank you so very much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I do appreciate it. And keep on with the good podcasts.
Absolutely. Will do. Thanks. Okay, guys, I hope that you liked this episode. Please subscribe to the newsletter. I will be releasing tons and tons and tons of good information. And also, I'm creating a sort of a subscription model where you can get the main takeaways of the podcast and also the meta-analysis of we talked about in the podcast. So it will be released as a document that you can just, go through. So if you don't have the time to listen to the whole podcast, or you want, like specific comments on what was said that I didn't have the time to go into during the podcast due to, time limitations, this subscription is for you. It will be available on my website soon. That's the only product that I will probably release this year. I really want to create awesome podcasts, and a lot of people requested me, the notes of the podcast because they didn't have the time, or they said, what do you have to say about what your guest said on this? And sometimes I do have, things to say, but the problem is that the podcast, this one was also 2 hours long. The podcast takes a long time to record, and there's no, it's not, time is not unlimited, sadly, and I can only do so much in terms of questions and comments. And I did interject Elliot in this podcast quite a lot, actually more than I should have. And so, this document will be the next game. I have more freedom and more time to comment on what was said, sometimes linked to research as well. So I hope you guys like this. And even if you don't plan to subscribe to that document, to that series of summaries and meta-analysis of the podcasts, just subscribe to the newsletter, because I'm releasing tons of good information, like stuff that I've been researching for a long time, and I've put my ideas together, and now I'm releasing in bits of valuable information through the newsletter. So again, I hope you guys like this. If you didn't subscribe to the channel, please do. I will release tons of interesting podcasts like this and more. And I think this will be very useful to you. Okay, signing out now. In good health. Take care. Bye.